So, the other day, Angry Joe gave Guild Wars 2 a 10 out of 10, and this isn't necessarily a video about whether that score was merited or whether I feel like Guild Wars 2 actually deserved that, but rather I was reading through the comments on it, and there was certain stuff that just kept coming up and coming up and coming up. People that were disagreeing with the score that it got, and a lot of people were talking about how disappointed they were that people had already reached Endgame in Guild Wars 2, and it's not just on that video. I saw it a lot on that video, but sometimes in game as well you see people say certain things that just seem off, and I feel like people think they're delivering a valid criticism when they're not really. So I wanted to do a video about reaching Endgame. Not Endgame itself or any of the problems anyone might have there, because I've not participated much in Endgame myself as it is, and I'm a person, I would say, a bit ahead of the curve, so I doubt many people are in a position to talk about Endgame itself right now. But I wanted to have a discussion about reaching Endgame, because I would consider myself there now. So this isn't maybe a video for my normal audience, but for a lot of the people that seem to maybe not understand fully what's going on here, because let's face it, Guild Wars 2 is a pretty different game to other MMOs. So in the traditional MMO setup, of course, you have the leveling process, and then once you are finished leveling up and you have finished your story or going to all the major regions in the game, you then reach end game. And end game is essentially repeating a lot of very difficult content, being rewarded for repeating this content over and over for unique rewards you can't get anywhere else in the game. It's something to keep you playing once you have reached the end. So a lot of people look at reaching end game as a valuable way of judging how much content the game has, and that's perfectly reasonable. You get there when you're at the end, when you've finished everything else, so you can see how long it takes people to reach end game to decide how much content really this MMO is offering you, and that's a perfectly logical and reasonable way of going about things. So when people see everyone saying, oh, people are at end game in Guild Wars 2 already, it's reflecting negatively on the amount of content that the game has to offer people, because they think that so many people are already finished with everything it has to offer. Well, as I say, I now consider myself to be at endgame, so I'd like to talk really how long it actually takes to reach this and how we should really be judging how this is all set up. So first of all, I would just say this is one misconception that a lot of people have, that endgame in Guild Wars 2 doesn't necessarily mean reaching the level cap. Reaching the level cap will make endgame slightly easier, so for the purposes of repeating a lot of it and maximizing your time, yes, it is valuable to be at level 80, but that doesn't mean being level 80 automatically means you've seen all of the content in the game, not by a very, very long way. In fact, it's very easy to rush to level 80 and skip most of the stuff. We had people do that in the first couple of days, but really that's an insignificant achievement in Guild Wars 2 compared to other games, because it's deliberately set up this way. You can deliberately reach 80 reasonably quickly. One of the features of the game, one of the things ArenaNet deliberately innovated on and they wanted to change from the traditional MMO formula, was the leveling curve. They didn't want each next level you go to take longer to reach than the previous one. They didn't like that idea. They gave us a flat leveling curve. They said it's probably fun to level up once every hour and a half or so, so that's what we're going to do for the majority of the game. Reaching level 79 from 78 takes about as long as it takes to get from 54 to 55. There's no real difference there. So don't look at people getting to level 80 as meaning everything in the game has been exhausted. That is the first major issue here, because even when you are level 80, all the earlier level zones are still viable and fun places to go to because you're scaled back down. The scaling metrics themselves can feel slightly off every now and then, I will say, but the entire world and all the content it has to offer is still available to you at level 80. So level 80 really has no bearing on endgame or how much content the game's got. So how do we consider someone to be at endgame if you can't take the level cap into it? Well, going back to what endgame actually is, it's once you've done everything else. That's what it originally was meant to be, right? It's keeping people playing the game once they've seen and finished all other content. So why don't we just look at where that is? When does that happen for Guild Wars 2? When is it we've pretty much finished, or we consider us to have finished pretty much everything, and now we only have endgame left? Well, for me, I would say, and this isn't a very good line to draw, but I would say in general, getting world completion and finishing your personal story, so the main quest line, is probably a good place to say that you're at end game. It's a poor line to draw, but it does mean you've been to every single region in the game, you've finished all the skill challenges, you've done all of the heart quests there are, you've been to all of the points of interest. Generally, you've seen everything and you've been everywhere. Now, it is a poor line, as I say, because so much of the game's content is based on dynamic events. These are basically your quests of Guild Wars 2, and these are only running at certain times, so it's very easy to go into a map, be told by the game you've got 100% there, but really you haven't seen most of the the quests or dynamic events that there are. So even this is a poor line because you haven't necessarily seen everything. You haven't seen all the cool stuff. You haven't seen all the big bosses because those events simply weren't going on while you were there. But it does mean you've seen a good chunk of the stuff. Now, this isn't accounting for things like PvP or World vs. World or crafting, all those extra things that you can still do in the game and are content to be experienced in the game. But really, I think they should be cut out because you have to appreciate that not all players enjoy crafting, not all players enjoy PvP. So just keep it to the very generic stuff. If you do partake in these activities, you will find there is even more content in the game. But let's be as conservative as possible and assume we're dealing with a player that just doesn't like any of that other stuff. So when you reach this point, when you've got your 100% world completion, most players are probably going to have two choices. They can either roll another character, say, right, now I'm done, I've got my 100%, I'm complete, I'm going to go play a different character now, because you get a different storyline and so forth, because there are so many different branches, or they're going to want to go and start the end game stuff. They finished the game, really. So I feel like this is a reasonable line to draw. Now, I've done this. I'm pretty much at this point. This is why I feel like it's okay for me to make this video now, and it took me 253 hours to reach this point. I didn't spend much time on those other types of gameplay that I mentioned above. I maxed just one of the crafting disciplines, of which there are many to do in the game, so I didn't spend that much time crafting, and particularly with PvP and World vs. World, I didn't spend much time at all doing. So that took me 253 hours to reach that point. To reach Endgame, really, for Guild Wars 2, I would say for most players, it takes around 250 hours. I wasn't particularly rushing it. I wasn't going, oh, must get this point, I must be one of the first people to do it. But then I wasn't necessarily idling either. I wasn't sitting around for ages talking to people. I wasn't being particularly sociable and stopping to have chats with randoms. I was mostly just communicating with people in my own guild and playing forward from there. So I would say that I was one of the faster players to get it in terms of hours, especially considering I was someone that went into Guild Wars 2 already knowing a fair chunk about the game, its mechanics, and the kind of things we'd be doing. For a totally new player, I would expect that to be around 300 hours, and if you really are a fairly casual player, then perhaps even a lot more than that. So that's the kind of ballpark you should be looking at when you're judging Guild Wars 2 and how much content it's really got to finish, to be done with the game, to reach endgame, as it were. And you have to ask yourself on that whether it's worth your money. Not how quickly you can get to level 80, which can be done in under 12 hours, I'm sure. Not how long it takes before the game will allow you to start participating in endgame, which is only level 35, but rather by generally your 100% completion of the map. And even then, as I say, that's a poor line to draw. There's a lot more outside of that you can still feel compelled to go and do once you reach that point, rather than going to end game. So really the question is that value for your money? Is a £50 game or a $60 game that gave you about 250 hours worth of content worth it? And the buck should stop there. The problem with MMOs, though, is there's this culture now that MMOs have to maintain our attention for hundreds upon hundreds or even thousands of hours, and people don't like the idea that 90% of those hours spent are going to be repeating the same areas in the end game treadmill. But really, we're going to have to start taking a step back from that. The buck should stop. Is $60 or £50 worth these 250 hours that I got out of it? Because now we're getting into an era of MMOs where there's no such thing as a subscription fee. Before, this would play on people's minds because they were paying a subscription fee. Every month they were spending more and more money on this game, and they wanted to feel assured that every month they could go in and feel like they had something to do, have some fun, so they were getting their money's worth. But now, so many games don't have sub fees. Big MMOs don't have sub fees. Guild Wars 2 has launched without one. A lot of games still do launch with one, but as you can see, they are rapidly turning free to play. We are reaching a new era of MMOs here where subscription fees aren't a thing to consider. So this culture of an MMO having to hold our attention for thousands of hours will start to go away. Look at this as any other single player game. Even with the most conservative of views here, where we're saying 250 hours to complete absolutely everything, and you hate PvP, you hate crafting, you hate all of that other stuff, you're definitely not doing endgame, you don't want to re-roll another character, is that still decent value? I would say definitely yes. So I don't think this whole idea of, oh, people are already at Guild Wars 2's endgame is any kind of criticism of how good the game actually is. I don't necessarily like falling back on this argument of, well, it doesn't have a subscription fee, so it doesn't need to keep you playing anyway, because it can still keep you playing. That somehow seems to undermine the amount of stuff that really is there in the game. It can keep you playing, and despite launching a game that doesn't have a sub fee, the devs are still trying to cater to this mentality that an MMO has to keep you playing for a very, very long time, which is a good thing, and hopefully hopefully that will continue on. Hopefully MMOs will continue to be these massive, long experiences that you end up building very large communities inside. But when we're looking at value for money, there is nothing wrong with playing Guild Wars 2, just the core stuff that I just mentioned, just doing that, and then putting the game down and coming back when an expansion comes out. There's nothing wrong with doing that, and that shouldn't be taken as a fault of the game or something that the game did wrong if people feel like they want to do that. So anyway, that's all really I had to say about that. I'm actually looking forward to going into Endgame myself now. Just need to get a few good teams together and actually get some good cohesion between us, and I'm looking forward to seeing how that lives up, whether that is the Endgame itself is actually any good, and maybe I'll do a video on that topic when that time comes. In any case, thanks very much for watching everyone, and I will see you next time.